Lecture 7, Skepticism and Jansenism, Blaise Pascal.
Welcome to Lecture 7 on Blaise Pascal and the question of skepticism and Jansenism. Every 6 or 7 lectures, I should remind our audience that my purpose here is not to advocate for this or that way of looking at the world, not to argue for the truth or falsity, wisdom or fatuity of any given system of thought, but to make these ways of thinking come alive as the historical phenomena they were, and to let us understand other minds in other places. And that is true of every one of the lectures in this series. You should not be able to infer my own beliefs from any of them. My goal is to make systems of thought historically real and intelligible to you. Today we turn to the problem of skepticism and Jansenism, both of which we'll explain, because for all of the growing attraction of the new philosophy in the 17th century, with its empiricism, its quantification of its view of nature, its criticism and rejection of traditional authority and the Aristotelian system of natural philosophy, there are very deep skeptical strains in the 17th century. Skeptical, that is, about the claims of human knowledge. Skepticism is one of those words that has undergone a radical transformation from its original meaning that endured from the Greeks through the 17th century to the modern day. In the modern day, skepticism tends to mean skepticism about religion. Indeed, skepticism from the ancient Greeks until the 17th and 18th century was a philosophical perspective that argued about the severe limitations of all claims of human knowledge. And again, the essential skeptical proposition is that nothing may be known with certainty, that neither by logic, which always culminates in paradox and has the problem, if you think back to the lecture on Descartes, of the criterion of truth, nor from the senses, which are errant and always misleading, may things be known with certainty. The dominant form of skepticism in the 17th century, and indeed in the 16th and 17th centuries, is known as fideism, from the root fide, faith, from the philosophically skeptical position that human knowledge cannot attain significant certainty. Fideism argues that that should convince the seeker after truth of our absolute dependence upon faith and grace. That the proper response to the humbling of human reason and claims of human knowledge is an awareness of the necessity and the power of faith. There are 2 particularly influential and deep models of such fideism in the 17th century. One of them, the Catholic thinker, Blaise Pascal, about whom we shall talk in this lecture, and the second, Pierre Bayle, a figure largely unknown today, but an author of exceptional renown and influence in his own time and throughout the 18th century, and we shall return to Pierre Bayle in a subsequent lecture. Had Blaise Pascal never entered the arena of religious writing, had he never addressed issues of fideism, he would be a celebrated figure in the history of 17th century thought for reasons that lend a very dramatic force to his fideistic writings, because Pascal was a figure of a quite exceptional and brilliant scientific career. He was a child prodigy in mathematics. He did groundbreaking work on conic sections and cycloid curves. He is an essential figure in the history of barometrics, fluid dynamics, pneumatics, and the mathematical calculus of probability. His father was a tax collector in Normandy, and Pascal even devised a calculating device based on a binary system of zeros and ones to make calculations, which is why one of the premier programming languages in the computer age is named in his honor, Pascal. The fact that Pascal was at the frontiers of the scientific revolution of the 17th century, the fact that he was so deeply involved in the kind of knowledge that could be acquired by inductive empiricism, quantification, mathematical reasoning, lent particular force to his turn toward fideistic philosophy and theology. Pascal, with a few fits and starts, because there are questions that he always feels obliged to return to in science, and above all, disputes and debates that he will not abandon to his adversaries, Pascal nonetheless essentially abandons his extraordinary scientific career after his encounter with a movement within European Catholicism that is known as Jansenism, named after a Dutch bishop, Jansen, who had written a book on the theology of Saint Augustine. Jansenism can be looked at in several ways. It is so controversial in the 17th century that almost anyone who comments on it in the 17th century does so in a biased and partisan manner, and we won't attempt to adjudicate those disputes in this lecture. But Jansenism can be looked at in several vital ways, one of which that it is a continuation of a very ancient contest in the West, and indeed in Islam as well, between piety on the one hand and the pursuit of a rational philosophical theology on the other. Within European Catholicism, it is a continuation of the intense contest between Augustinianism and Thomism. That is to say, followers and would-be disciples of St. Augustine and of St. Thomas Aquinas, as argued in the 17th century, above all, over issues of the consequences of the fall upon the human will and upon human reason, and upon issues of salvation. It is the view of Jansenists that the fall had categorically catastrophic consequences upon the human will, and that without election by God and grace unmerited, given by God without any merit or desert on the part of the recipient of that grace, the human will was incapable of choosing the good, was incapable of choosing reconciliation with God and turning away from sin. Also, for Jansenists, the consequences of the fall upon human reason and knowledge were catastrophic, though here Jansenists tended to divide, and Pascal is on one extreme end of the spectrum of that divide, though he will be the most influential Jansenist. All Jansenists agreed that we were corrupted in the fall by our reliance upon the flesh, the sensory, the things of the senses, and that knowledge acquired through the senses and attempts to know God through the senses were doomed to failure. The senses linked us to the evil and depravity of this world. The senses led us away from salvation, and many Jansenists, though not Pascal, loved the philosophy of René Descartes, because without reliance upon the senses and the body, he had given us proofs of God and the soul and the distinction of the soul from the body that were based purely upon something of the spirit, mind. But other Jansenists, including Pascal, who will be Jansenism's most influential voice in France, believe that the consequences of the fall upon human reason were such that we were incapable by reason itself of knowing any significant truth, of knowing anything essential about the nature of reality and about the nature of God. Jansenism also stresses that human beings stand in absolute dependence upon the grace of God for their salvation, and that grace is personal, that it is something given by the election of God to the individual sinner, transforming that sinner into someone sanctified and justified in God's eyes through grace. This poses difficulties within a Catholic context, and Jansenism is a movement within European Catholicism because of the role of sacramental grace in the Catholic Church. That is to say, the Church dispenses God's grace through its sacraments of baptism, of communion, of last rites. Jansenism accepts that there is a role of sacramental grace, but when it looks at the Catholicism around it, it is scandalized by Catholic reliance upon the sacramental grace of the Church as a means of avoiding the need for personal forgiveness and for personal encounter with the grace of God. A leading Jansenist work by the brilliant philosopher Antoine Arnauld is a work called Of Frequent Communion. And the scandal that Pascal denounces are worldly individual Catholics who go to confession, do penance, receive absolution, and then recommence their sinning on Monday. Sin on Monday through Saturday, and then undergo the sacramental ritual of frequent communion. As Arnauld will write, Christ did not die on the cross to give us the scandal of frequent communion, but to give us an efficacious grace that overcomes the depravity of the human heart and saves us. The Jansenist convent at a center called Port Royal, which will be razed to the ground when the French monarchy moves against Jansenism, becomes a center of moral and ecclesiastical revolt. When the Crown and the papacy denounced Jansenism, and the Jansenists urged the French Church to reject that denunciation, Jansenism will become a center of religious and political opposition in France. Throughout the 18th century, an underground of opposition to what it sees as the worldly evil of the monarchy and large parts of the established French Church. And there are many historians who see it as contributing mightily to undermining the old regime and the monarchy before the French Revolution. Pascal will give up his scientific career in despair after meeting the Jansenists over his own relationship to God, saying that he can tell by his inner life that he is not saved, and that the God of the philosophers, the God who is the object of a philosophical proof by the Aristotelians or by Descartes, is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and is not Christ on the cross dying for the sins of mankind, our sole source of real understanding and salvation. After Pascal's own experience of what he believes is God's grace upon his soul, Pascal abandons his scientific career and becomes one of the great religious apologists of Jansenism, Catholicism, and Christianity. Now, there is a word in need of explanation in terms of its early modern meaning. Apology, apologia, in the Greek, does not mean an apology for one's belief or an apology for one's life. An apologia is a defense. So an apologist for the faith is not someone who says, I'm sorry about the faith. It is a defender of the faith. People who write apologia pro vita mea, an apology for my life, are writing a defense of my life. And Pascal becomes a profound religious apologist. Upon his death, which occurs at the age of 39, his friends at Port Royal discover in his papers a set of thoughts that clearly were supposed to be the foundation for a major work of apologetics. And they published these shortly after his death as Pascal's Pensées, his thoughts on religion. It is his Jansenist friends who put them in order, who arranged them thematically. But the publishing history of the Pensées shows us that Pascal touches remarkably deep chords in 17th century culture. They are a sensation. They go through edition after edition. People love the Pensées, and they move debate and belief in very different directions. The themes of the Pensées give us the direction of Pascal's apologetics. First, the misery of human beings without God. What is human life? It is an endless quest for diversion. We are forever unhappy and will do anything to avoid being alone with ourselves and our own self-consciousness. We will do anything foolish, talk to anyone. We will hunt not to catch animals, but for the thrill of the hunt. Anything to divert us from being alone with our own consciousness and the thought, who am I and what is my fate? We are creatures who experience two absolutely extraordinary emotions: hatred and self-hatred. enmity toward others, hopes that friends fail, fear that others will succeed, and as if that is not tragic enough, self-loathing, self-contempt, self-harmful behaviors. The misery of man without God leads to the simultaneous realism, if we look at it, and absolute absurdity of the human condition. Who could explain hatred and war? In Pascal's celebrated phrase, a river is a boundary between two countries. On one side of the river, my friend. On the other side of the river, someone I shall be praised for killing. That absurdity is the human condition. We see a plain man and we feel nothing but contempt for him. But put on a judge's wig on that person, or the robes of a king, we feel awe and reverence. Could there be anything more absurd than human beings and human life? The world works not through charity, not through love, not through wisdom. It works because what ties us to the things of the world, concupiscence, love of the things of this world, makes us fear for what happens if we don't honor contracts, if we don't obey the laws. And we see a world that generally functions. God was good enough to allow our love of the world to give us a modicum of peace and the ability to live human lives. But all around us, unhappiness and irrationality. Mankind, for Pascal, is a mass of inexplicable contradictions by any natural attempt at explanation. We are creatures of such genius. You look at the frontiers of science and mathematics, and creatures of such ignorance, lost in superstition and absolutely absurd belief. We are capable of remarkable science, but we lack ethics, morality, decency. We are filled with energy, but it is an energy without purpose. We are capable of extraordinary subtlety. Look at our works of art, and we are capable of grossness, of beastliness, almost beyond comprehension. We are creatures of endless self-assertion, and we are racked by fear and guilt. We are creatures of reason, and yet almost everything we do is arbitrary and indefensible custom, done because, well, here on this side of the river, that's the way things are done. We are creatures of intellectual weakness. We have reason without sincerity, and we believe what we want to believe. We are governed by false appearances. The influence of passion and prejudice upon our minds and beliefs is an influence to which all human history and literature testifies. The empire of imagination upon us is such that the greatest scientist, seeing a black cat walk across his path, is in terror. Knowledge is relative to the kind of mind that we possess, some of us intuitive, some of us needing to follow out ploddingly, proof by proof. And even among our geniuses, we have an absolute inability to grasp the infinitely large or the infinitesimally small, between which, nonetheless, we must place ourselves and our lives. Well, you love to gamble, Pascal writes about his contemporaries. You think you're so wise and you love to gamble. And the 17th century is an age when everyone gambles. Everyone plays chance. That's why Pascal's works on probability make him one of the heroes of the intellectual world. Everyone gambles. And Pascal offers what he calls the logic of the wager, which is terribly misunderstood if one believes it to be a proof of God. It is not a proof of God. For Pascal, there are no proofs of God. Human reason is weak. Human will doesn't want to believe. The wager is a way of showing people what fools you are not to see what you should want to be true about the world. What is Pascal's wager? And he says you have to bet. You can wager that there is no God. There either is or isn't. That there is no God. And supposing you wager there is no God and you're right, what do you gain? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. What do you lose? Infinitely everything. If you wager that there is a God and you're wrong, what do you lose? Absolutely nothing. If you wager that there is a God and you're right, what do you gain? Infinitely everything. What human being faced with that choice? On the one side of the wager, the possibility of no loss and infinite gain. On the other, the possibility of infinite loss and no gain would not at least want there to be a God. Would not take that as an incitement toward belief. But then one turns to the philosophers and sees the insufficiency of knowledge of God without knowledge of Christ. What is the God of Descartes? A perfect being at the end of a philosophical proof, or a first mover, or a first cause? In what way does knowledge of such a philosophical God make comprehensible to you your hatred and self-hatred? Evil and human nature remain incomprehensible given only the God of the philosophers. There is, Pascal will write, an infinite distance between knowledge of God and love of God, and no philosophical proof gives you love of God, for you are still left with the inexplicable world of human depravity and suffering and self-hatred and unhappiness. Faith's reply is the Christian revelation. Now, it has its reasons. It can prove itself by prophecy, by the power of grace, by the miracles of Christ, by the consequences of belief. But that is not why one believes. The heart has its reasons that reason cannot understand. One believes the Christian revelation by the heart because it reconciles one to God. It leads to love of God. It makes sense of life if one has been touched by the grace of that revelation. If we understand Adam's fall and redemption through Christ, we understand our dual nature. If we understand our original creation by God and the fall, we understand why we are subtle and gross, wise and stupid, capable of beautiful things and of grossness and baseness. We understand why there is evil in the world, and if one understands the sacrifice of Christ and the redemption of human nature through Christ, then one is reconciled in one's heart to an understanding and a love of God that has nothing to do with philosophical proof whatsoever. For Pascal, looking at the world from a Christian perspective is like looking at one of those trick pictures. You look at it from one angle, it appears to be one thing. But you look at it now with Christian faith achieved through grace and an understanding of the fall, original sin, redemption through Christ, our original nature, and our depravity since the fall, and everything falls into place. And what one gets is not philosophical conclusion, but inner peace. And that peace and salvation, not philosophy, are the goal of life. And reason is only useful to humble reason. But think on the implications of Pascal arguing the incompatibility of faith and reason in what is justly known as the age of reason that is emerging in the 17th century. Thank you very much.